Hey everybody, it's Mr. Bognon. I'm only saying this because we haven't met in person yet and it's the end of first quarter. Unbelievable. But anyways, hey, it's Mr. Bognon, and in class recently we've talked heavily about federalism. And specifically today in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about two different types of federalism: dual federalism and cooperative federalism. And to help with this, we're in my kitchen. Don't worry, it will all make sense in a bit. And so if we had to rewind just a little bit, and we had to explain what federalism is all about. You all know that federalism is dope. Division of power, yee! It's so exciting. Federalism is so exciting. Everybody, federalism is dope. Division of power, yee! So what does that division of power look like? And what is division of power? Well, if you recall, you all know that there was a huge issue with who should have the power. Should it be the states or should it be a central government? And under the Articles of Confederation, most of the power resided within the states. But that was a huge fail, as you young kids say, because there was no leadership at all. So that led to the Constitutional Convention. We rewrote our social contract, and now our supreme law of the land is the Constitution, where the division of power now, up to this day, is divided between the federal government, federal, national, central, all mean the same thing as a reminder. So the federal government and the state governments, and there's 50 states. So without further ado, let's go ahead and take a look more in depth of why we're in my kitchen. Excuse me, I'm just so excited. And what federalism looks like today and what it looked like before. Come on! All right, so we're in this kitchen for a reason. We have to bake some cakes. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's put some coffee in here. Let's put a coffee mug. Since all of you keep asking what's the tea among your conversations, I'm assuming it's because you love tea. So let's add some tea. And let's go to the candy jar here and we'll add some Starburst, yada, yada, yada. And with the help of movie editing magic, we now have a cake. Whoa, so cool. Look at this cake. Whoa, it's so beautiful. Oh, that's just a label that I put on everything that I bake. Take a look at my masterpiece here. You have this beautiful layer cake. All right, so if you're a master baker like me, you all know that layer cakes are separated by frosting. And so if we take a look at this analogy that I'm using right now with the cake that I just baked, right? So if you take a look at that cake, you all know that there's multiple layers and they're clearly separated. There's a fine line between which layer is which. And this is exactly what dual federalism is all about. There are certain powers that the national government has, and there are certain powers that the states have. Period, as you young kids say. There is no gray area. National government has certain powers, state government has certain powers. Period. We all took a look at the Constitution last unit, and you all know your amendments. The 10th Amendment, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, J, J means just states. If it's not listed in the Constitution, then the states have the right to decide on that specific matter. That is what the 10th Amendment is all about. Period. And so we lived in a system of dual federalism from the inception of the Constitution all the way through the 1930s. I'll get to the 1930s in a moment. But dual federalism essentially stated that some powers are given to the national government and there are some powers that were given to the state governments. In fact, there were more powers given to the state governments, again, because people feared a large national central government. They didn't want government to get too big. Alrighty, so what were some of the powers that the national government had that the states did not have? And what were some of the powers that the states had that the national government didn't have? Well, let's take a look. The national government has the power to declare war. Only makes sense. Could you imagine a world where an individual state such as Nevada can declare war against another country? It would be insane. Only the national government has the power to declare war. The national government also has the power to create our armed forces. The national government has the authority to admit new states. The national government also has the power to coin money. Various states under the Articles of Confederation had their own currency, which was why the Articles was a fail. So who has the power to coin money? Only the national government. There are many other things that the national government had the power to do, but those were some of the more important ones. So what were some of the powers that the states had, that the individual states had? So in class we talked about the analogy of CCSD. and you had within CCSD a number of different high schools, and each of those high schools have different needs. And so with federalism, the emphasis was that most power still resided within the states, or in our case, in the analogy, powers resided within the schools, because who knows your state more than the people living in your state? Who knows your schools more than the people who attend those schools? And so under federalism, there is a lot more power given to the states than what the national government had. And so these powers included laws that could be decided within various states relating to property. And this also included slavery, whether or not slavery would be legal or if it would be abolished. This also included policies on insurance, on education, on construction, on elections. Which is why some states have decided to send every single registered voter a mail-in ballot in some states like Nevada, and why some states decided not to do that because, again, states have the power to decide. It's not the federal government telling every state what to do. The states can decide. On licenses, and I'm not just talking about driver's licenses, but licenses to teach, licenses to become a barber, licenses to become a construction worker, licenses to become, you name it. So every different state had different laws and powers relating to all these various topics because the state still had power. And again, the 10th Amendment stated that if it wasn't listed in the Constitution, then those matters should be decided within the individual states. Alrighty, so another point I'd like to mention on federalism is with state power again, and that is that states had the ability to experiment. So you could consider like all the states being science labs to see what worked and what didn't. So for example, recently in 2012, marijuana was legalized in Colorado. And it was legalized because the states argued that they can now collect taxes to fund schools. So what happened when those few states legalized marijuana? Well, other states then wanted to legalize marijuana, and Nevada was one of them a few years later, stating that if we legalize marijuana, we could collect the money from the taxes and fund our schools. And so federalism, again, is a way of experimenting with what could work and what couldn't work, and it allowed the states again to have power. Again, power that the national government couldn't say no to. So what happened in the 1930s? Well, just that. There was chaos. There was a depression. You've learned this in U.S. history. In the 1930s, people needed help. The states couldn't give it to them, and the entire country was in shambles. It was a depression. People lost their jobs. People lost their life savings. The stock market crashed. People were waiting in line at food banks, at soup kitchens. The entire country was a mess. The president at the time, Herbert Hoover, stated it was up to the individual states to figure it out. Thank you, dual federalism. People didn't like this. And so during the election, a new president was elected. And his name? FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Fun fact, I won Best Book Report on Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 3rd grade. Alrighty, so how did the federal government in the 1930s help solve the issues with the Depression? Well, if you remember back in AP US History or US History in general, you've talked about the New Deal. And the New Deal was essentially a bunch of alphabet soup. You had the Works Project Administration, you had the Social Security Act, SSA, WPA, PWA, etc., and these were programs from the federal government that were designed to help people get back on their feet, be employed again, start earning money, and to get the economy rolling again. And so these programs were created from the federal government. They weren't created by the state government, they were from the federal government. And they were supported by grants. And so what the federal government did was, hey, states, you're in shambles right now. So here I am, federal government, and we're going to give you money. We're going to give you grants. And you're going to use this money to enforce our systems that we have in place to get people back on the road. So for example, there were some projects that dealt with creating parks. And so money was given to states so that they can create parks. For the first time in history, the federal government said, look, we understand states that you're going through some trouble. And we're going to go ahead and create all these different programs, and we're going to give you all this money so that you can help your citizens in your states out. So the New Deal also created the Social Security Act, where you, as a person working, pay into Social Security so that by the time you're in your 60s, you'll earn a monthly income from the federal government to help you live while you're no longer working. Also, if you become unemployed, Social Security comes in to help you when you're down and out to prevent another depression. And so here we have the federal government spending more money than it usually does to help people when they're down and out. It's a welfare program. And so for the first time in US history, here we have the federal government, big federal government, helping people. Shouldn't that be the state's job? Also, tell me, where in the Constitution does it state that Social Security should be a thing that the federal government creates? I thought the 10th Amendment stated if it's not in the Constitution, then it's up to the states to decide. What's going on? The government's getting big. And so they replaced this marvelous layer cake with a huge marble cake. And like the master baker I am, I baked this myself, and it may look like it came from a store-bought container, but trust me, it didn't. But what does this marble cake have to do with this new federalism that we are taking a look at, called cooperative federalism? Well, for the first time in history, power is no longer divided clearly by the clear lines in this layer cake. Power is cooperative. The federal government and the state governments are now working together to get stuff done. And so using this analogy with the marble cake, okay, as you can see here, there is no line. There is no line. There's two types of batter that were mixed in together to create this cake. This is what's called cooperative federalism. The lines are blurred. And so who has the power now? Who has the power? Is it the federal government or is it the state governments? Where is it clearly defined? Here it's clearly defined. Here it's not. And it's kind of a sneaky way of the national government getting more power. So for example, in the 1950s, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the emphasis of connecting our states with the surge of many vehicles being produced was on America's priority list. And so when they gave states the funding to build the freeways to connect the various different states, they said, hey, states, we're going to give you this money. However, you're going to have to enforce the speed limit. Otherwise, we're not going to give you this money. Kind of sneaky, huh? And the states obliged. And they said, okay, give us the money and we'll do what you want us to do. And so many people thought of this as the expansion of the power of the national government. And many people are starting to say we need to revert back to the old ways. The states should have more power. The states should have more authority. The government's getting too big. And so when we go into those types of arguments, now we're going to start looking at political ideologies. So to recap, cooperative federalism involves both the federal government and the state governments to work together. Okay, there's no longer a line with dual federalism because that line is removed with cooperative federalism. Remember, layer cake, clearly defined. Marble cake, they work together. They're cooperating with each other to get stuff done. But the consequence of that, some people argue, is that when the federal and state governments work together, the federal government is getting bigger. So the biggest question now is, which type of federalism should we be following? Should we be following federalism in which states have more power than the federal government? Or should the federal government kick in so that things are consistent among all 50 states? Federalism is kind of confusing. It's the shared power between federal and state governments. It expanded in the 1930s. And people are now arguing that government's getting too big. Is that a good or a bad thing? That's something I can't answer because it all depends on your political ideology. And that's something, again, that we'll take a look at next unit. Until then, I'm going to eat all this cake! So since one of my students made fun of how the cakes are designed here, I decided to bring my own cakes. And as you can see, this is a layer cake. There's 2 layers filled with icing in the middle. This is the line between federal and state power, all right? But when you take a look at the marble cake, you can see that there's two different batters mixed into one. There's vanilla, there's chocolate inside. This is cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism is when the federal and state governments work together. Now, class, what is federalism?
Federalism